Namaste. Welcome to our Charcha Chat on Hinduism and menstrual health practices with Sinu Joseph ji. My name is Vishnupriya Parasaram. I serve as the VP of Education and Advocacy for Hindu Students Council, and I will be leading the Q&A discussion today. Sinu ji, welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Namaste, Vishnupriya. Namaste to all of you. Thanks to you for joining at 9 a.m. on a Sunday morning to have this discussion. I really look forward to it.
Nice. So just a brief introduction about Sinu and the work she's been doing on menstrual health. Sinu Joseph G is an educator, a writer, and an activist on menstrual health. Her work offers a unique perspective on menstruation by unearthing ancient Hindu science behind menstrual practices, as explained in Hindu texts such as the Ayurveda. As an orator, she has given many lectures on the science behind menstrual practices in Hinduism. Personally, I have enjoyed how she simplifies complex scientific concepts into bite-sized, easy-to-understand explanations. Her book Ritavidya delves into this ancient science behind menstrual practices. So, before we get started, I wanted to just quickly share the purpose of why we're having this discussion today. So breaking the taboo around menstruation has become a very mainstream and a very prevalent topic. And this presents a need for an authentic Hindu perspective, given the depth of knowledge our tradition has to offer. Concepts like menstruation is natural and it's not something to be embarrassed about are often termed as these new novel ideas in the West. But for us, Hinduism's perspective on the topic, like those ideas are the foundational ideas in Hinduism. So to start off with, Sinoji, what inspired you to learn about the science behind menstruation from a Hindu perspective? Did you face backlash from the community when you first started being outspoken about it?
What a wonderful way to start this discussion, Vishnupriya, and thanks for the lovely question. So, I am at heart and by work someone who has been in the social space in the NGO sector for about 11 years now. So, when I started my work, one of the projects that I took up was to go to the rural schools in India, in the villages, and talk to girls about menstruation. So, we would make it a very light conversation. I would begin by sharing some seemingly embarrassing episode from my childhood associated with periods, and then the young girls would, break their inhibitions and they would start sharing. It would be a lot of laughter, a lot of fun, and then the actual conversation would start. So I would throw open the room for questions, and I would ask the girls to ask whatever has always bothered them about this subject, whatever they wanted to know. And every single time, the majority of the questions asked by girls, not just in Karnataka where I work, but across India where I have traveled, have always been associated with the cultural practices. Obviously, most of the girls were Hindus, so their questions were about why we should not eat certain types of food during menstruation, why are we told to rest, why are we told not to exercise too much, why are we told not to visit the temple during our period or participate in certain puja and rituals. This was the nature of the questions that came up. And like most others, for the first few years of my work, I will be honest in saying that I simply dismissed them. I told the girls there's nothing to this, it's just superstition. And modern science does not talk about any such restrictions. So go ahead and do what you want. But Vishnupriya, the minute I would say that, all the laughter, the joy, the exchange, the interaction would just slowly die down,
Mhm.
because unknowingly I would be telling the children that their mothers and grandmothers and their entire lineage of ancestral women were wrong, were superstitious. And then the children will stop confiding in me. And it took me a while to recognize this shift in their behavior and in their openness because of what I would dismiss as just having no basis in science. Somewhere about 3, 4 to 5 years after I did these sessions, I just felt that if there are so many women, and whichever part of India I went to, Jharkhand, Bihar, across Northeast or down South, whichever part of India I went to, I found that there were very, very similar practices followed by women who were not, on social media or interacting or influencing each other. That meant that there was similar understanding of this culture across the nation, which women had traditionally learned and orally passed down from generation to generation for thousands of years.
Mhm.
So that forced me to re-question my own perspective and really wonder about, could it be that there is something about this that I myself haven't understood? And that was the starting point, that was the turning point. And it's from there, when I started asking people, I started learning more things. Then I started studying the texts pertaining to Ayurveda, to yoga, to Tantra, to the Darshanas. And one thing led to another. And much to my own surprise, so many of the practices they follow are almost exactly what is prescribed in Rajaswala Paricharya of Ayurveda text. That is basically the menstrual regime. And none of these women would have studied Ayurveda. So
Mhm.
it's fascinating how this deep science was made to reach the last person simply through culture and tradition. So because the questions were asked by Hindu girls and women, it the curious the scientific person in me just delved into that. That was the direction in which I looked. But eventually, of course, I saw that in some other religions also, the practices in Islam, for example, of not performing the namaz during menstruation, or among Orthodox Christians of not receiving the communion during menstruation. These also exist, in fact. And of course, much later, I realized that across the world, wherever the native cultures were allowed to thrive, there were very, very similar practices around menstruation. And it just vanished when Christianity took over and imposed their rules and restrictions on people. So that was the start. That's how it happened.
Wow, that is such a empowering story to hear. Like, even though at first we may not be aware, but seeing that all these things that we label as superstitious have so much science to it, it's so cool to learn about. And you mentioned that you do a lot of work with NGOs. So was this topic kind of something that was hard to talk about at first? Did family, friends, community say, "Oh, like why is it that you're getting yourself into all of this mess?" Did anyone say things like that?
Well, the thing is, for the longest time, nobody, including many of the people who work closely with me, could understand what I was saying. Because I would talk about Pancha Prana and Dosha and Apana and Udana, and they were like, why are you making it so complicated? And
Mhm.
the difficulty was in conveying that this, in fact, was our own native science, and we have lost it. And there is no half measure that can be taken. You can't pick up the word hygiene and then try to say that no, no, these aren't taboos. The whole conversation of hygiene itself is a created one, it's a fake one. There is no study that shows that use of particular product, except for tampons and sanitary pads, can actually lead to vaginal infections or reproductive tract infections. And yet menstrual hygiene became a movement entirely driven by economic reasons and promoted by manufacturers of products. So, in the NGO space, NGOs consider themselves as really little tiny people doing tiny little things. And for them to survive, they depend on funders, on donors. When it comes to menstruation, all the funding, all the donations come from those who, somewhere or the other, are linked to manufacturers of sanitary products. And their sole intention is to penetrate the rural Indian market. And in order to do that, they work to create a need. And that need comes to the shore by shaming our women, shaming our culture, and shaming our nation. That's their method. That's how they work. And I know this firsthand because there's hardly a brand of sanitary pad manufacturers in India that did not approach me to promote them or to be their ambassador and things like that. So I know what is required. And at every step, I refuse to do that. My team and I, we did not take funding from anyone to do this work. It's entirely unfunded. And that is why it is the truth.
Right.
But many NGOs find it very difficult to take that call because they make an issue into their means of livelihood, and instead of working to reach the root of the problem and completely solve the problem, they themselves end up sustaining on the issue becoming an issue. So
Mhm.
for the longest time, there was what we were saying through Maitri Speaks as the Bharatiya perspective on menstruation, and then there was everybody else on the other side.
Mhm.
So
Right.
we've been alone, completely alone in this. And
Mhm.
that's when we felt the need to put it down in a book so that this narrative can be understood from end to end, and that there needs to be a new generation of people, both men and women, who can understand this as a vidya, as Rutu Vidya, and
Mhm.
start talking about it afresh, completely free of the existent conversations that are just about hygiene, promoting shame and products. So it's like pressing a refresh and a restart button. Personally, even for me, it required me to completely take a U-turn somewhere about 4 or 5 years into my work, where, of course, I too started talking about menstrual hygiene. And at the peak of my work, I was offered awards and recognition and all of that. People said she's the next pad woman, and I said, please don't give me that tag. It's bad enough that we have called someone pad man. I am not pad woman. That's not what my work is about. And we refused all that. We consciously refused all the awards because people who were offering us awards did not understand what we were talking about. And we
Mhm.
made that U turn and we stuck to the conversation about the Bharatiya perspective to just drive home the point that nothing in this culture is superstition. Nothing in this culture is without science. And it's not a theoretical science, it's an experiential science.
Mhm.
So, yes, there have been difficulties in conveying this, especially to the people closer to me, because there's this saying in Hindi, right? Ghar ki murgi dal barabar. So even I began being taken seriously by those around me only after the book was out and after some platforms invited me for conversations. Till then, it
Mhm.
was just this thing that Usinu makes everything so complex, and she just introduces too many new terms which we can't follow. Why can't we just simply say hygiene and go and distribute pads? It's so much simpler. So yes,
Mhm.
those difficulties were there, but we've come a long way. It's just been 1 year since Rutu Vidya was released, but Shravya, who's here with us, and so many of them have joined this movement, I will say. And without celebrities, we are all just ordinary women learning
Mhm.
through our experience of menstruation, learning from our grandmothers, learning from our ancestors, learning from our native traditions. And that's the best way to go about it because it's so completely uncorrupted. In fact, it cannot be corrupted because it's
Mhm.
not an ideology, it's an experiential learning process. And I wouldn't have wanted this to be any other way. It's just perfect the way it's unfolding. It's perfect.
Beautiful. Yeah, so like touching back on those concepts of how Western feminism and like the Bharatiya perspective on what it means to be a feminist, if I had to use an English word for it. Shravya was actually talking a little bit more about this. So I'll just introduce Shravya and she'll come on and ask a few questions. So, Shravya is one of our youth volunteers from Dallas, Texas. She's a tech consultant by day and food blogger by night. Namaste and welcome, Shravya. Take it away.
Thank you, Vishnupriya. Namaste, Sinuji. Um, it's a pleasure to be in conversation with you once again. The co-read for the Rituvidya book, which happened a few months ago, was honestly a life-changing experience. Just the community that we brought together with the co-read I have to say that I'm still in connection with them. We still chat in the group chat every day. We talk about more things related to, all the so many things, related to Rituvidya that were mentioned in the book, just delving more and then having somebody to talk to. I think you should do it again. So it was a really great experience. I would love for more people to tap into that experience. So I've mentioned this many times, I think, during those sessions, but my favorite chapter in the book is the chapter about how menstruation is a gift and a blessing, and I think that is a chapter that every young girl should read, because we, especially in the Western framework, are made to feel from the very first day we get our periods that it is a very gross experience. We're made to feel weak about it, that, there's something, like we need to like empower ourselves. We need to fight the pain and, go out and conquer the world exactly in those 3 days. The rest of the time, it doesn't seem to matter as much. So so it's almost like they make us feel like it's a burden, because every time we think about it, every time we're planning something, we're like, oh, my period's gonna come, I don't know how I'm gonna do it, right? And that's how the community around us makes us feel. But this chapter talks about it in a very different light, right? It's almost, I was really like, there's like a bulb that went on in my mind when you kind of talked about how it's like a capitalistic framework, right? That brought this kind of sense about menstruation onto us, just like how you mentioned the economics of pads and tampons, right? So and I really like the statement that you make about how we are forced to suppress like the feminine in us to become a feminist. So leading from that, I would like to ask, what would you say is a core difference between Western feminism and what, like, feminism is in the Indic perspective, in approach to menstruation?
Thank you, Shravya. Thank you for presenting the context so beautifully, and what you understood of it. Uh, it's so heartening for me to see uh, my children. I think of you as my children, one of them, to embody what I've been trying to convey for so long. It's not theory for you; you embody it, and that's so wonderful to see. The question that you asked is something that all of us need to ponder about. Just think about it. Every movement of the feminists, the feminism movements, what are they about? They are about women or supporters of women asking others to give them their rights. This could be asking men, asking the government, asking society, everybody around you. What does that make you? That makes you inherently a very weak, helpless person, because you believe that somebody else has power over you, and unless that person gives you power, you are nothing. So far from being an empowering movement, feminism and the feminist movement is a highly disempowering movement by its own nature. And all of it, when it comes to subjects of menstruation, reproductive health, is about suppressing menstruation. So FDA approves pills which will allow you to choose the number of times in a year that you can decide to menstruate or not at all. You have conversations with, say, well, if I'm not having decide, if I'm not going to have a biological child, why even bother with the uterus? Just throw it out and be done with it. And they think that this is empowering, and they think that this makes women stronger. I don't know how they can be so disillusioned. I mean, this is Maya working at the highest order. I don't know what else to say about it. It's the most disempowering, physically and emotionally damaging movement for anyone who thinks of themselves as feminine. Forget females or the gender women, anyone who wants to connect to the feminine. The feminist movements is the absolute wrong place to be. How did we view it? How did the Hindus view it? For the Hindu, the feminine is Shakti. Shakti is that unmanifest power arising out of Brahman itself in order to create the entire universe. The concept of the creator for Hindus is feminine, it's a creatrix. So she's everything. Even all the Devata Shaktis are forms of Shakti. That's why we say Devata Shakti. They may look like a male deity, but it is Shakti, it is the primordial feminine power. And it is understood that this Shakti operates in everybody, yes, but somehow it is more enhanced in those who are born with the female form, or who we refer to as women. So when we are manifestations of the creatrix herself, where is the question of someone from outside empowering us? The question itself does not arise. Instead, every woman strives to make herself strong enough not to ask and to grab and to take from others, but to be in a position to offer to others. Our inherent strength comes from being Shakti by making ourselves capable of offering to our families, offering to communities at large. And that's why women among the Hindu families were the natural leaders. You go to any of the traditional homes, even now, it is the grandmother who has the final say in all the matters, not the grandfather, not the son, the grandmother. Every decision on property, on marriages, anything that's important, the grandmother, the woman, is the one who decides. That's who we inherently are. And who is the grandmother? People like BBC will come in and see that, oh, she's wearing a gunga, she stays in the kitchen and cooks for everyone. That's all they are able to see. But who is she? She is the one who knows about every member of the family, everyone's personality, everyone's health, who eats what, who is unwell, who is well, who needs to be married, who needs to focus on studies. She knows everyone, and she's the one who's been supporting every member of the family and her nearby community voluntarily. She's the biggest giver there is. And that is true empowerment. And that is the role model that Indian women, especially Hindu women, grew up looking at. That is the feminine. And that is what women need to try and become. One who gives, not one who goes around asking like a beggar, feeling so helpless about herself. That's the completely stark contrast that exists between feminist movements of the West and the feminine movement that arises out of the Hindu parampara.
Thank you so much, Sinuji. I think that was a beautifully drawn contrast between, the Western and the Indic. Honestly, I think it's really disheartening to see how far we have come from the original to what we are today, even, within our families, right? I think a lot to learn. Honestly, I think you should maybe pen your next book should be the role of the feminine, something for the next generation to, of course we have like our families and our mothers and our grandmothers to look up to, but nowadays we're all about social media. If social media or a book tells us something, it's like we'll get that done. So it would be wonderful to see work like that from someone like you. So my next question is actually related to kind of the spirituality behind menstruation. So it comes from the chapter on Ma Kamakya. So many times in our traditions, men and women play different roles, right? So men have a different like nitya karma that they do compared to women. So why is this? Can you please shine some light on how a period signifies like the spiritual realization for a woman, or why she doesn't have the same sadhana prakriya as a man?
That's a very important question, and it's honestly somewhat difficult to answer for one who does not, who's not willing to make the experiential journey of what is written in the book. Let me talk before I come to this the spiritual aspect. Let me talk a little bit about the physical aspect itself. What menstruation does for a woman, which it does not do for a man, and that's the first thing we need to understand. So, if you read the book Rutuvidya, then you would know that menstruation is a time where an internal detox process happens by removal of the internal toxins that we call ama. And the more there is accumulation of ama in your body, the more women experience menstrual discomfort. So they may experience nausea and vomiting if there's ama accumulated in the upper digestive tract. They may experience cramps because of gastric issues. They may experience loose bowel movements if there's excess ama in the lower intestinal tract. They may have acne, that's the toxins, coming out through your skin. All of these problems are directly related to how much ama you've accumulated. But menstruation is that monthly detox process. In the absence of menstruation, this ama accumulates in your body and starts the process of creating all kinds of disease. If it penetrates to the deepest tissue layer, to the seventh dhatu, as per Ayurveda, it could even result in infertility. And to prevent that, nature's gift to women has been this natural removal of ama once every month through menstruation. If you look at the lifespan of an average man and an average woman, you will see in most countries, unless there is something to do with war, that most of the diseases, the lifestyle diseases, cholesterol related problems, high blood pressure, diabetes, heart conditions, they happen sooner for men, not for women. And the reason is that women have this monthly natural removal of ama, but men don't. So, how do men have this equivalent cleansing of detox? By imbibing processes that will continuously allow their body to detox bit by bit. That is why yoga and chanting and the Sandhya Vandanam and all of that is mandatory for men to be done every single day, because nature does not automate the process for you as it does for women. So, this is the first thing that we need to understand, that the physical gift that women have via menstruation once a month, men do not. And to make up for it, they need to do a certain sadhana. Now, if you move to the spiritual aspect of it, it is understood in the Hindu tradition, in the Hindu religion, that the human birth is the highest form because your human body is the vehicle through which you can realize moksha. It is only when an Atma takes birth in the form of a human that this process can happen. So, with your body being that vehicle for you to happen, for moksha to happen, it is so crucial that you keep your body well. For women, even if once in a while we jump, we take it easy, menstruation does the work for us. And by the time we reach menopause, we are reasonably healthy and we can start the spiritual journey just as men do. But if a man ignores his health in the early stages by not doing sadhana, by not doing yoga, when he reaches the same age as a woman who has menopaused, he struggles to survive. There are heart attacks, there are all kinds of diseases and problems. Forget the spiritual path, you can't even have a normal physical existence. That's how difficult your body becomes. And that's the way to understand it. Sharira margam kalu dharma sadhanam. This is what Kalidasa has said. Your sharira is the marga for realization of dharma. For a woman during her menstrual years, at the time of menstruation, if she does certain chanting or yoga or dhyana or pranayam, it will adversely affect her period. And if your period is affected, your physical health, your mental health, emotional health, everything goes for a toss, is it not? There cannot be a one with a female form who says my period is messed up but my health is fine. That's not possible. If your overall health, physical, mental, or emotional, has to be fine, then the core, the fulcrum of it is menstrual health. So there are so many rules around menstruation so that we maintain our health. For men, the equivalent of this is daily dedicated sadhana, so that by the time they have the maturity to take to the mark of moksha. For women, the transition happens so naturally through her body. She grows up. When she becomes a mother, automatically her anahata, heart chakra opens up, and she just, without even asking for it, she enters the spiritual path. And with menopause, it just comes to a full circle and she just very naturally takes to it. But for men, at every step, it is an effort. And it's an effort they have to make if in this birth they have to go closer towards moksha. So this is some of the things that we need to understand before we start saying that, hey, why can't I do what they do? The truth is, you need not do what they do. And in fact, if you do what the men do, it will affect your menstrual health and will cause you complications, unnecessary complications. When it comes to the spiritual experience, Because of menstruation, women's bodies are very, very sensitive to the subtle energies. When you walk into a temple, when you walk into a place that's highly charged with Devata Shaktis, women can experience it much more easily than men who do not do sadhana. That's why bhakti happens very easily for women because they experience the Devata Shakti. It's a full body experience, it's not an intellectual one. But for men, it's very difficult to drop the intellect. They always use their mind to understand even spirituality. But it's only through sadhana that they will learn to drop the intellect and experience it like a female body. Experience it through their body, through bhakti. For that to happen for men, they need sadhana. For women, we are naturally like that. That's the difference, and that's why the rules are different for men and for women.
Thank you so much, Sinuji. I think what you said is absolutely right. And again, right? We're all made to feel like the emotional aspect of being a woman is a sign of weakness. So I think we have a long way to go. But it was an honor to share the screen with you once again. I will pass it back to Vishnupriya to invite the next speaker.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sravya. So next, so celebrating the first period with friends and family is a really common practice across Hindu society, especially in South India, where you have these family gatherings where the whole neighborhood is invited for huge lunch or dinner. So it's really a celebration that's in place to make this young girl feel very special and very loved in a very a turning point in their life. So, but then like parts of the same community, especially in the urban areas, consider menstruation to be a taboo, and the West portrays Hindus and Indians as backwards or superstitious, despite such beautiful practices that we have in place. So, like, why are there such inconsistencies in the attitude towards menstruation among Hindus, and also how people outside of the Hindu community view us?
That's an interesting question, Ms. Vishnupriya, and it requires all of us to contemplate on it. You know, the first and the foremost thing, you said this point about others calling our practices as taboo and calling Hindus as backward. The thing is, regardless of how others see us, it is what we feel about ourselves that finally makes the point. So it does not matter what others think or say of Hindus. But as a Hindu, how each of us relate to ourselves and our practices, that's what matters. Always remember this.
Mhm.
If each of us are strong in our conviction of what our practices are, it does not matter if every person, every other person in the world says something else. The problem happens because we ourselves are not convinced. And we are so weak in our understanding that the slightest breeze and we fall. That is the real problem. It's not what people are telling. It is our own lack of conviction because we haven't made enough effort to understand our jnana parampara through our experience, through pratyaksha pramana. The most beautiful thing of our shastras are the pramanas, the proofs of knowledge. And they wrote how you can go about understanding if something is true or not. And of the 3 or 4 methods, the very first method is pratyaksha pramana, that is knowing things through direct experience. So we go on talking theory after theory about temples, but if we can go and sit in a devasthana and close your eyes and simply experience the nature of the chaitanyam there, you will not need to read any book on what is a temple. How many of us are making that effort? That's the only problem. It's not what others are talking about us. That's the first and foremost thing that we have to understand. that we make an attempt to know these things through our own experience. You mentioned that this is more among urban women and girls. You're absolutely right. Why is it not so among rural girls and women? Have you thought of that? It's not so among rural girls and women because they are not as exposed to the conditioning from outside. They go in a very simple way through their experience. So when they practice menstrual seclusion, when they celebrate their period, they're able to witness and see how their period is easier than that of somebody who does not. And when there are groups of girls and women who are able to observe their own body and say that, yeah, this month I took rest during menstruation, my period was easier. Last month I had to, participate in some physical activity and my period was problematic. They are very observant about their body. That is the only difference. But we urban women, we lack such confidence. Actually, this method of learning from our experience does not exist in the Western education system. It's all about external lab based peer reviewed research. Some third person has to tell you that your hand is in fact your hand and this movement is the movement of your hand. Otherwise, you're not sure what you're seeing, whether it's your hand or somebody else's hand. It sounds ridiculous, but that is what modern research is about. It's about somebody else validating what you should know. When in fact, every single piece of knowledge of jnanam comes from within. There is no other way of knowing something other than from within. And the whole process of yam, niyam, asana, pratyahara, pranayam, all of that was to purify the within so that the true knowledge, the true jnanam comes, surfaces on its own. That's how we understood science. That's how we understood phenomena. We are not doing that anymore. And that's the real problem. It's not somebody else talking about us, that we ourselves are not making enough effort to understand these things firsthand. And the moment that changes, the changes that you are making in your life, the changes that Shravya is making in her life, that will naturally create an atmosphere where your own conviction, your own confidence will change the discourse. It will happen in your lifetime. But the change should and must start with you. You have to be the starting point for it. There's no other way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that also goes back to how, like, is it really a central aspect of Hinduism is experiencing and not just reading from a book or listening to a lecture. And going back to that point about menstrual seclusion, Samyukta was actually our uh, one of the students who will be asking a question here in a minute. She was watching a documentary, so she had a question about that. So Namaste Samyukta. Samyukta is part of our college leadership board and is a freshman at UC Santa Barbara studying physics. Namaste and welcome Samyukta.
Namaste Vishnupriya and Namaste Sinuji. It's an honor to meet you and speak with you today. And going off the topic that Vishnupriya brought up, which is how the West portrays us and how our menstrual practices. I was watching this documentary. It's called Period End of Sentence on Netflix. And this documentary presents the stories of women from rural India that make pads and work to destigmatize menstruation. So my first question is in regard to a clip from this documentary that shows a young woman saying that placing restrictions on menstruating women from going to the temple is discriminatory and misogynistic. Let's watch this clip.
महावारी में नहीं आते हैं मंदिर में, किसी के लिए नहीं, किसी भी चीज़ का मंदिर हो, ये मानते हैं जो घर के बुजुर्ग हैं, ये मानते हैं कि ऐसी पूजा लगती नहीं है, आप चाहे कितना भी कर लो।
क्योंकि जिसकी हम पूजा करते हैं, जिसको हम भगवान मानते हैं, माता रानी है, मतलब वो भी तो एक लेडीज़ है, वो भी तो हमारी तरह ही है। तो इसलिए मुझे नहीं लगता कि मतलब उस टाइम पे जो ये सब बोलते हैं, जैसी विचारधारा बना रखी है कि ये गलत है, गंदगी होती है उस टाइम पे, तो मुझे नहीं लगता ये होना नहीं चाहिए।
So you mentioned earlier how companies tend to shame women in order to create a market to sell more pads. So I was wondering if this video was kind of related to that. But my questions overall was does this documentary accurately portray our cultural and viewpoint on menstruation? How do you think the perception of Hinduism is being affected by interpretations of menstruation from the West? Or I know we shouldn't be affected by it, but it's still, how is the perception of like youth especially affected by it? And how does a North American high school student, how should they respond when questioned about our unique menstrual practices?
You know, when this documentary was released and when it won the Oscar, the thing is, just a few hours before it won the Oscar, the students from this particular university in America who were part of making it sent me an email. And this is something I've not revealed too much. This was an email apologizing to me for portraying Indian girls in the wrong way and for presenting statistics that were false, because they just about found out about my work and my writings on this subject, and they were writing to me with the hope that I will not respond or react or take action. And they literally pleaded me to never mention their names or the names of their university. This was about 2 to 4 hours before they won the Oscar. So when they won the Oscar and they were all there on stage receiving it, I was the one person who knew what hypocrites they were, because just hours before they wrote to me apologizing for the erroneous presentation of Indian women in this film. And here they were receiving an Oscar for it. This is really what happened, and I never revealed their stupid names or what happened, but I did write about this film and why at so many levels it was complete misrepresentation of menstruation in India. These young girls who are shown in this video, completely fed by the NGO Plan India who was behind this. Plan India, Action India, I forget their name, something like that. And a few months back, it was revealed that the NGO and these women had some conflict and they went their different ways. So I know how these things are manipulated and made to look, and there isn't a bigger evidence. I have the letters from the very makers of the film apologizing to me for misrepresenting Indian women. What more can I say about this? But that tells us a lot about the Oscars, doesn't it? It tells us a lot about how these things are so clearly agenda driven. And I wrote about this. Those who want to know can visit my blog, mythreespeaks.wordpress.com, and how this movie is something that India, they owe an apology to India and to Indian women for completely falsely presenting it. What we can do about it? That was the question, right? When people ask us about this, and when we do, if you aren't, I don't feel that everyone should pick a fight, because it's nasty business. And unless you reached a point where you have a certain peace within, you must not take on these things, because it will affect you. And there's no point in it. So if you want to battle this out, then you must do a lot of sadhana. You must invoke the presence of Devi to make you an instrument for leading this change in a positive way. But if that is something that you feel you're not there yet, then the thing for you to do is what I've said before. Start making the change in yourself, and there will be a ripple effect from that. The entire world, the life, the things that we see, people's minds, it is all a projection of our own mind. That's something we need to learn, we need to understand. The minute we change the source of what we see around us, which is our own mind, the minute what we project changes, you'll be surprised at how everybody else's response starts to shift. But you have to make yourself that. You have to empower yourself in that way, that you become that focus which can influence a larger audience in a positive way. So again, the work is personal. We have to start with the personal work, even if we want to take this up as a narrative, as an argument, as a battle out there. We have to first work from within. I see so many of our dharmic people being completely exhausted and tired because of the kind of criticism that is constantly thrown at them. And that's because I believe they don't do enough sadhana. They don't do enough personal work. Their intentions are beautiful and I always wish them well. But it is out of my concern for them, their own well being, that I say this, that if you want to go out there and battle, strengthen yourself from within. You be that embodiment of Shakti, that nothing negative will ever touch you or the things you say. Remember, there's a responsibility. You are carrying the message of your ancestors, you're carrying the deep wisdom from the Vedas. You can't be a weaker person. So you must work to strengthen yourself from within, to lead this conversation, to become an instrument through which the right kind of knowledge can be led and can happen. And when you do it like that, nothing and no force in the world can put you down. And you will see how things will shift, energies will shift, minds will shift in your direction. Everything will start gravitating around that bigger mind. So the work has to be from within.
That's really inspiring. Think about how it's really interesting how even when questioned, you, instead of like, your initial response of like, oh, I must go out and fight, or I just leave this situation, you have to think about yourself first before you think about the other person questioning you. And that's really nice. But I guess a follow-up question I have was, I guess in college, most people are just unaware of what our culture is, right? Especially in Santa Barbara, where there's not much of an Indian population or Hindu population. People don't know anything about our culture, so they ask questions. They ask questions out of innocence and like not of malice. I think about like Bindi and other questions. So how should you respond to them? Should you take your time to explain all of our practices, or should we just say it's really complicated? Our culture is there, but something like that.
If you want to teach someone about this culture, help them have an experience of it. Then the learning happens automatically. So that's what you have to do. If someone says, why do you practice menstrual seclusion? You have to tell them, why don't you try doing it and observe the difference? And then we'll have a conversation later. So let them just do it for a few months. If they really want to know, tell them this is the way to learn. Do it yourself. I do it and I see. So never theorize things that you haven't experienced. That's another rule. So if somebody asks you, why do you follow menstrual seclusion? You should be someone who has done it and who has experienced the positive benefit of it. And only then should you talk. Otherwise, you say, I frankly don't know. Be honest. If you don't know, you don't know. But if you want to answer something, let it come from your experience. Nothing is more convincing than your experience. And when it comes from that, and if the other person wants to know it, very naturally, they will start imitating you. They will try to have that experience to see if this is real or not. See, that's a core difference between Christianity and Hinduism. We never tell people to have blind faith, whereas Christianity is all about don't ask questions. Whereas Hinduism is all about ask questions, be curious, seek. We are all essentially seekers. There's no harm in questioning, but must never be left at questioning for the sake of finding fault. We must question to seek. The inquiry should be one within. And if there are people who ask like that, help them find those answers through their experience. In Manusmriti, one of the things that is written is, if somebody asks you a question, and if they don't ask the question correctly, with the correct intention, if they don't ask, then you might be the wisest rishi in the whole world, but remain silent. Remain silent. It doesn't matter if you look like an utter fool, but don't answer a question which is not asked with genuine intent of a seeker. That's what Manusmriti says. So I never go around giving advice to people unless they ask a question. And even then, only if they ask with the curiosity, with the intent to learn, to seek, only then should you answer that. When we do sessions for parents on teaching children about child sexual abuse so they can prevent it, one of the questions for parents is, at what age do we start telling the child about all this? And you can't fix an age and say, no, the minute the child turns, say, 10 or 11, then you must have this talk. It's not like that. When the child asks a question, you must give an age-appropriate answer, is it not? So if a 5-year-old asks, who put the baby in mama's tummy? You will answer one way. If that same child is 10, you will answer another way. And if the child is 15, you will answer in a whole different way. It is the same thing with this. You should be able to assess who's asking the question, what is their level of understanding, how genuine are they in their questioning, and then point them in the direction in which they can find the answers. That's the way our rishis taught us. That's what Manu has told us how to go about it.
Got it. I'll think about putting that into practice from now on. That's very good advice. Thank you, Sinuji. So pivoting a little bit from this, I remember in your book you talked about Ayurveda and how it's fundamentally different from modern science. And I was wondering, because I study modern science, I think, in school. So are they completely different, or is there a way to reconcile them or like, combine the two to teach to future generations in an ideal kind of situation where it's included into practice?
It's a beautiful question, and I want to say upfront, science is one. Okay, science is whatever science you take. Science is one. The difference is in the depth of understanding. So in the Indian systems of science, like Ayurveda, we have the knowledge of the gross physical body, which we call the Sthula Sharira. And then we also have the knowledge of the subtle body, which we call the Sukshma Sharira. So the atomic, molecular, and higher understanding is the Sthula Sharira, which is what modern science is. But we also had the deeper level, which is at the subatomic level, at the quantum level, which we call quantum biology today, and that is the Sukshma Sharira. So when Ayurveda talks about Tridoshas and the Panchabhutas, it is the knowledge of the Sukshma Sharira, the Vayus, the Pranas. It is all Sukshma Sharira. It's at level below the atomic understanding of the human body. When modern science talks about organs and systems and glands and all of that, it is the atomic level. It is the Sthula Sharira. So they're not different. Science is one. The minute modern science enters the realm of quantum biology for diagnosis and treatment of disease, it will be like Ayurveda. But Ayurveda already had surgery and other things, so Ayurveda is complete. It is modern science that has to go into the Sukshma level. And once it does, it will be very similar to Ayurveda. It cannot be different. Today we talk about nanomedicine and nano understanding of things. What is that? It's very similar to what Ayurveda spoke about. So across the world, whether it's Chinese medicine or the medicine of the Native Americans, they all were different from today's modern science because they understood the Sukshma Sharira. We understood prana, things that you cannot see, but you know it is there. Physics, on the other hand, they made that quantum jump very well. They spoke about forces that the body, you cannot see with your senses, but you know it's there through their effect. Gravity, for instance, you can't see it, but you know it through its effect. Right? So biology should have immediately adopted that and said that, hey, if physics can do, what would it be like if we understood that in biology? If they made that effort, they would arrive at the quantum understanding of the human body, which is nothing but Ayurveda. So we will get there. We will get there when it's time. But I see Ayurveda as complete. Yes, we have lost the surgical practices in Ayurveda today, and modern science has flourished in it. And that's where we can, borrow some things. But the bigger lessons and the bigger learning definitely is for modern science. They have to make that jump to understand life at the subatomic level, not just theoretically, but in diagnosis, in prevent. You can never prevent disease if you don't understand the Sukshma Sharira. You can only work on treating. Prevention has to do with understanding the root cause of problems, and that's quantum biology, not molecular biology.
Okay, understood. Yes. It's interesting how I need to do more research on like Sukshma Sharira and stuff, because I'm interested in how they did it without that, like the same like technology and like being able to see with like the microscopes and stuff that like all like back then and everything.
In fact, that's the thing, and you actually touched upon a very important point, because you cannot understand the Sukshma Sharira through equipments, and that's where modern science is taking so long. You can only understand it through an internal process. How did our rishis arrive at that knowledge? It was through intense yoga. They would go into the states of samadhi, which were superconscious states, which opened up parts of your brain which does not function for normal people. So it's what, about 10% of our brain is what we utilize, right, as per modern science. The rishis tapped into the rest of the brain, areas of the brain that you otherwise don't access. And they did that by going into states of samadhi. This is an internal process. And through that, they had a pratyaksha experience of prana, of vayus. They saw that as clear as day. And as long as the scientists of modern science try to find this in labs and external things, it won't work. And that's why they're taking so long. The process is not outward, it's inward. And that's why our rishis did it, and they could not. They have not yet been able to.
It's something to think about. Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Sinu. And that's pretty amazing. I think those are all the questions I have. Vishnupriya, do you have time for anything else, or what's the next steps?
Thank you so much, Samyukta. I think those were some really insightful questions. It's so cool to learn about how the West and the East are just so, there are some similarities, but there are just some really cool, unique things that we can learn from the Ayurvedic perspective as well. So continuing on with our discussion about mothers and menstruation and menstrual seclusion. You mentioned in your book, in a chapter where you talked about there are so many traditions in regards to food. You know, there are things like sesame seeds and turmeric that are kind of incorporated into the food habits of women across India. So like those practices are easier to adapt, integrate into the modern hustle and bustle. But do you see a future when it comes to not restrictions being in place for the safety and well-being of women? Do you see restrictions being in place in mandirs, not just in India, but in the West, where it's encouraged, restrictions are in place to um, kind of protect women from entering the temple during that time? Do you see that as a part of the future?
Well, it's in the present already, at least in India it is. So with every temple that is built as per the Agama Shastras, the rules are very clear that menstruating women should not enter. And if it's a temple that is a moksha dham like Shabrimala or places in Kashi and Kailash, if it's entirely the temple is built with the purpose of moksha, then it is very clear that even women who are not menstruating at the time but who are of the menstrual age should wait until menopause before they visit such places. This is something that's known in the temples here. It's not something that we need not explicitly state because everyone knows. That's how it is among the Hindu women here. It's only among the few modern circles that they are questioning things, they've lost connect with things, and then the temples have to put up boards saying don't enter. But otherwise this was common knowledge. And even outside India, we need to make this common knowledge. The only thing we can perhaps do differently is that in the past we made this common knowledge by somewhere bringing in women's mind um, the fear about disrespecting the deity by going into a temple during menstruation, rather than explaining the reason of how it will affect her in a negative way. In the future, it's my hope that when we bring in these rules for women, we also make an effort to explain to them how these rules are in place to protect their own reproductive health. That's the thing that's missing, and I feel that's the only thing that we need to add in the future. The rules are there, it's just that we've lost the meaning of it, and therefore we look upon it as something that's there to suppress women when the reality is completely the opposite, that it's there to protect women. That communication needs to happen. It's a difficult communication, I know, but we should make an effort to make that change happen. Yeah.
Right. So, like, throughout the discussion we've had so far, along with what Samyukta and Shravya have said, we touched upon a lot about not going to temples during menstruation. Like we've kind of, I guess from reading the book and from watching your videos, we kind of have a generic understanding of how it can affect the health of women's bodies. But for those in the audience who are just hearing this for the first time, could you please like just explain it briefly?
You mean about the temple specifically?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So, I will explain it briefly, but if you want to know the details, you can watch my other talks on Sangam Talks, or you can read my book Rutu Vidya, because it's a difficult thing to explain in a few minutes, because there's so much knowledge which and terminology from the Indian knowledge systems that would be new to all of us, so it takes time to digest all of that. So I'll put it in a very, very simple manner, but look it up and study more if you're interested. We all understand the phenomenon of gravity outside in our living world, right? It's what keeps things moving downwards. It's what keeps us on the ground rather than floating up and above. Now, our ancestors understood that if gravity exists outside, then certainly there must be an equivalent of it within our body. So in Ayurveda, we call this force the Apana Vayu. Apana Vayu. It is one of the five forms of prana. It operates in the lower region of the body near the reproductive organs. It's gravity within your body, so its direction is always pointed downwards. It's the force that facilitates the movement of things downward and outside your body. So, elimination of waste, urination, defecation, the flow of menstrual blood, the release of semen in men, normal delivery of a child, all these are governed by Apana Vayu. This downward acting bodily gravitational force, if anything happens to change its direction or to block it, then all these processes that it governs could become problematic. Now, what might make this form of prana change its direction? There are some chants, so when men have to do some continuous chanting, there is the rule that you fast, you remain on upvas. Why? Because certain chants and certain processes and certain puja that you do will tend to turn all forms of prana upwards, including the apana vayu. What is upwards? Your higher chakras. These are the regions that facilitate the movement of prana upwards for a spiritual process to happen in you. This is a very oversimplified explanation. But if apana changes its direction like that, even for men who are into chanting and other things, they are told to practice upvas because it will affect your digestion and excretory processes. If you do excess chanting and if you eat heavy food, that's why visiting a temple to be done on an empty stomach, all festivals and religious performances to be done on an empty stomach or have something very light like fruits, that can affect the apana otherwise. When you go to a temple, your apana vayu will be turned towards the higher directions, towards the higher chakras. When you sit in dhyana with the focus on your Agnya chakra, it will turn apana prana. Apana vayu, we call it. We also call it apana prana because it is a subtype of prana. It turns apana prana towards the Agnya chakra higher. Menstruation now is a time where apana vayu is active during the whole time, 24/7 of the days when you menstruate, and it needs to be active. It needs to act downwards so that your menstrual blood can easily flow out because it is your body's lower gravitational force. When it is active like that, continuously moving your menstrual blood out, if you do practices that can tend to turn its direction, if you are sensitive enough, you will immediately observe it and experience it as cramps in your stomach. So, women who go to temples during menstruation, if they don't have any other menstrual problems that will block their senses because they'll anyway be in pain and then they cannot make out anything else, if they're not like that, if they generally have pain free periods, and if they go to a temple during menstruation, they will experience this cramping sensation. Based on the nature of the temple, They could even have extremely heavy menstrual bleeding. And I know this from experiences of women who shared this with me. If they continue doing this month after month, Apanavayu can completely reverse its direction, causing severe disorders like endometriosis, which is the problem where there is a retrograde menstruation. That is, the menstrual blood flows in the opposite direction into the fallopian tube, up the abdomen, and doctors have found endometrial tissue, which is the lining of the uterus, as far high as the heart. That's how Apanavayu had turned. Of course, modern science does not attribute this to Apanavayu because they don't have the concept of Apanavayu. But if you understand it, if the force that makes your menstrual blood go downward and outward itself turns, then menstrual blood's direction is also going to turn. That's a very, very painful process. Everyone knows how bad endometriosis is. So this is the reason why women are told not to go to temples during their period. It's not because you will spoil the deity, and all of that is a different dimension. You need not worry about that, but at least worry about your own health and realize that some of the problems that could happen to you are irreversible.
Mhm.
They're very, very serious disorders. It's not just about stopping of menstruation and things like that. Very serious, painful conditions can happen to you. And that's why this rule was in place in such a strict manner. So this is just a very, very brief highlight of it. But do read Rutu Vidya to understand it completely.
Right. And it's really interesting to see how these practices have been passed down from generation to generation, despite the centuries of colonization we've faced. And just, I guess it's just a testament to see how well rooted our grandmothers and their grandmothers were rooted in our culture and history. So when it comes to like the Ayurvedic perspective, outsiders usually tend to have this feeling of, or I guess Westerners in general, all these NGOs and stuff, tend to have this attitude of, okay, like we need to be rescued, we need to be helped out of our race. So through your work, when you run into NGOs or people like that, and when you explain to them like, hey, this is the Ayurvedic perspective, this is our way of doing things, it's beyond what you call modern science, are they often satisfied with your explanation, or are they not?
Well, the first thing is that I never go out of my way to talk to someone. I don't say, hey, listen, I have something to tell you, and then sit down and try to lecture them. I never do that because you will never receive jnanam like that. The transmission is not of an intellectual knowledge, it is of an experiential one. And for that, the person who is listening should be prepared. So only when so there are two methods, right? There's the push method, which is what you're referring to, and there is the pull method. Mine is the pull method. It's a slow process, it's an organic process. But when people come to me with questions, they are ready to receive. And then it becomes easier. I'm not advising them, I'm simply pointing them in the direction in which to look. Because through their own sadhana, through their own, even an honest seeking, the seed of jnanam has been sown in them, and Ma Saraswati takes over. And one thing leads to another, and I'm just one point in their journey. When people come like that, and all of you who are listening in are like that, Ma Saraswati is already acting in you, and she has brought you this far. It's all your doing. And when you are here, what I tell you, you receive it at a different level altogether. It's not intellectual, it's beyond that. And that's the way I choose to do it. And that's the right way in which it has to happen. That's why Hindus were never people who went out there preaching, converting, and it's not the right thing. It may look like it's working in the short term, and but in the long term, it's going to be a failure. At some point, people will wake up and realize there is no truth in this. Everyone has to make that journey themselves. You can only create an atmosphere where more people will be drawn to this sort of knowledge. and would be open to receiving. That's the only right way to do it, if you ask me.
Mm-hmm. Right. I think through our discussion today, there are a few things that we can all take away and practice ourselves and incorporate into our lives, like talking from a place of experience and not from a place of theory, and making sure that we're not constantly trying to push our beliefs, but instead, like you said, let people come to you and um, have conversations with people who come from a place of curiosity and wanting to understand more. So, um, the conversation. So, just to conclude this discussion, with one question is the conversation around menstruation is so dominated by the Western perspective. Like you said earlier, like we are the only ones that talk about the Bharatiya perspective or the Hindu perspective. So, I guess it's nice to have the sort of community where we have similar perspectives on things, but how do we remain rooted in the wisdom that our tradition has to offer in a world where the Western perspective is so dominant?
By practicing, by becoming practitioners. That's the thing. People from Abrahamic religions, they are practitioners. And very often Hindus are too chilled about that. We have a temple next door, but we don't visit. We feel, oh, it's just for, I'm too intellectual. People, we like to say, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual, sort of a thing. When people ask me about religion from the Christian perspective, I say I'm an atheist, because if it's Christianity, then I'm an atheist, because there's nothing in it. But if you ask me from the perspective of Hinduism, then I'm a very religious person. I'm not even saying spiritual, I'm saying religious. I go to the Devi temple every day, and I do my own practices. That is what is missing for most of us, because once you connect to that, to a Devata Shakti, then you will be led from one thing to another before you realize it, even if you don't have a community that you can connect like this. Even if that does not exist, you are already connected to a higher source that keeps you going. And that is a strength that is unshakable, completely unshakable. That we need to become more of. We need to stop trying to be fancy about Hinduism and saying, oh, I'm spiritual. I don't do temple visits. I just do only yoga. And the minute we are seeing differences in religion and spirituality and science, and I'm telling all these three in the same breath because they're essentially the same. But the minute we start saying that they're different things, we become open to being broken up.
Mhm.
We need to start understanding that the Hindu religion, the Hindus' understanding of spirituality and science, all these three are the same. And we need to be grounded and rooted in that as practitioners. And that's where we derive our strength from. That's where our strength will come from, even in future.
Mhm. Right. I mean, that is so empowering to listen to and understand that we can't just go around talking about theory, but we need to be practitioners as well. So thank you so much, Sinuji, for taking the time out of your day to answering our questions, joining in this Charcha Chat with us. And we hope to talk to you again, maybe with um, even at a larger event, maybe. And I personally, and I'm sure Shravya and Samyukta will also agree with me when I say that we've learned so much from not just by reading your books, but talking to you like this today. And thank you so much. And thank you to everyone that tuned in and joined us in this conversation today. Namaste.
Thank you, Vishnupriya, and thank you all of you for coming here. So you've done your bit and you have reached this far, and you go much, much further from here. May Devi guide every step of your understanding and of your journey. And thank you for making me a small part of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Namaste, everyone.